everybody. We're thrilled to bring you today's session led by one of the most respected voices in endurance and human performance, Josiah Middaugh. Josiah is a world champion Xterra triathlete, exercise physiologist, and longtime Vail Valley resident who has spent decades at the forefront of testing and training elite athletes. In this masterclass, Josiah will break down everything you need to know about VO2 Max, what it is, why it matters, how it's tested, and how you can improve it. Whether you're an athlete, someone optimizing for longevity, or simply curious about your body's potential, this session is packed with practical insights. Let's dive in and learn from the best. Josiah, take it away.
Thank you, Sophia. All right, so our topic is VO2 max, and VO2 max is regarded as the gold standard for your aerobic capacity. And so today I'm going to try to break that down into why it's important, not just for performance, but also for health and longevity. And it's just recently that it's gotten a lot more attention in the space of longevity. And I'll tell you why. There's a few studies that came out, and there's a lot of the VO2 max testing is a lot more accessible now, and people are using it for the general population a lot more, not just for elite athletes. All right, so we know that VO2 max is that gold standard for your aerobic capacity, and that obviously has some implications for performance, but it also has a lot of implications for health span, meaning your quality of life as you age and what activities you're actually able to do. And a higher VO2 max is going to have a big impact on that. And longevity, we'll talk about a couple studies that have come out that really link VO2 max and in some cases considered the most important metric for longevity. So first, let's define VO2 max. VO2 max is your maximal rate of oxygen uptake. So it's at the muscular level, how much oxygen your muscles can extract at peak exercise intensity. So what we use to determine VO2 max is a ramp protocol. And so on the treadmill, we'll start you at a really easy speed and then ramp up speed and or incline until we get close to maximal capacity. And same thing on the bike, we start at a really easy intensity and we ramp that intensity, but we need to ramp it gradually so that we can see all those heart rate zones and fat burning, but we also don't want it to take so long that you're too fatigued so you can't get to a VO2 max. So a good VO2 max test, usually that ramp part of it takes about 9 to 12 minutes to get to your max. And it really isn't that bad. It's maybe 3-4 minutes of really hard, higher intensity. And so that measure, the way I think of it is it's only as good as you are on that day. So that's your performance level on that given day. So it could be affected by something really fatiguing. It could be affected by maybe some detraining if you hadn't done anything for a few weeks. So it's only as good as you are on that day. But VO2 max, so sorry, a little off track, but what is VO2 max? That's that how many milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. And that's typically how it's expressed, that relative measure. So it's divided by your body weight. So if you're carrying around a lot of excess body fat, that's going to have a negative impact on your VO2 max. It can also be expressed in an absolute measure, and that's just how many milliliters or liters of oxygen you can extract at that peak activity. And you have a VO2, that VO2 at rest, you're still consuming oxygen, and then it just increases exponentially as you do more and more activity. And so the analogy of VO2 max, it's really almost a comprehensive measure of the performance of your body. It's a lot of different systems, mainly cardiovascular, muscular, respiratory systems, and how well they function together. But really, you can think of any body system could affect VO2 max, and even your movement economy, your muscles, your tendons, your ligaments, how well you function and move, those are all expressed in VO2 max. So VO2 max and longevity, you can kind of see if it's measuring almost every system in your body, you can see how it could be a really good metric for your overall body performance. And so that higher VO2 max, it results in a lower risk of chronic disease and death. And there's some recent studies. The most noted one is this recent study in JAMA that measured risk of all-cause mortality. And what they found is that top 2.3%, somebody that's in the 97th percentile for VO2 max has a 5 times lower risk of all-cause mortality compared to the group that's in the bottom 25%. And what they also found, there's no upper limit to the benefits of VO2 max. So when somebody comes in and say, oh, your VO2 max is excellent, you're in the top 25%, well, you'll get even more benefit from going from the 75th percentile to the 85th percentile, or that going from the 90th percentile even to the 97th percentile. And this is that graph that examines that. And what's really interesting about that study is they were comparing a lot of metrics and a lot of really striking risks for all-cause mortality, like cardiovascular disease risk, smoking, diabetes. Those were all measured against VO2 max, and VO2 max was the metric that showed this big stark contrast between that upper percentile compared to that bottom 25th percentile in all-cause mortality, and more than all of the other metrics. So think of VO2 max as kind of a global measure of how well your body functions. So we've got heart function, we've got lung capacity, pulmonary efficiency, we've got blood values, how well you're able to extract that oxygen from the lungs, carry it to the muscles, and then uptake it from the muscles. So it's really oxygen delivery and then oxygen utilization or oxygen consumption. And so there's a lot of things along that path that have to be functioning very efficiently. And when we talk about what are the limiting factors of VO2 max, it could be anywhere along that chain. When we talk about elite athletes, quite often it's that uptake at the muscles. So it's all at the cellular level, your mitochondria, your capillary density, and those aren't very visual. You can't look at somebody and say, oh, you have a high VO2 max or you have a low VO2 max. A lot of systems that are playing into that. And just like anything, VO2 max does tend to decline with age. And it can decline quite a bit with age. I might come up with that on the next slide. But as much as 10% per decade, but it doesn't have to. So this is kind of just an overall view of all the body systems that are involved. But if we think of it really simply, it's oxygen delivery, oxygen utilization. And so that's what that gas exchange is. And so what we're actually measuring with our PNOE VO2 max assessment is we're measuring oxygen, carbon dioxide coming in, oxygen and carbon dioxide going out. And so we can get the oxygen uptake. We can also get the amount of carbon dioxide that you're breathing off. And there's a lot that we can do with those ratios. There's actually 23 different biomarkers that we're measuring along with your heart rate, your ventilation rate, that ratio of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and a lot of different implications that we can get from those measures. All right, so how is that measured? So it's that little box there that's on the screen, and that's the gas analyzer. And so we calibrate it to the room. We know how much oxygen is in the room, and then we can measure that gas exchange. So it's just oxygen, carbon dioxide coming in and going out. And here's a bunch of confusing graphs that illustrate that. But let me just briefly talk about these. So that top graph is just blue oxygen, red carbon dioxide. And you see at those low intensities, the oxygen consumption is a little bit higher than the CO2 that you're breathing off. And then those lines cross and you start to hyperventilate and you breathe off a lot more carbon dioxide. And then the second graph, you see that yellow shaded area, and that is your fat burning. So there's a lot of things that we can measure with that ratio, and I'll talk about that next. But your fuel utilization, so how much fat, how much carbohydrate you're burning, what those percentages are at different intensities. And that's how we can set, it's one of the factors for setting heart rate zones. And then also we're trying to determine your anaerobic threshold. And don't worry too much about, oh, I thought lactate threshold was better. Oh, I thought it was called anaerobic threshold. Oh, no, I thought it was called ventilatory threshold. Well, all of those things happen. And that's that third graph there. There's a lot of things that happen around the same point. And I would prefer if it was just called threshold. But the anaerobic threshold that we determine is the same as your ventilatory threshold 2, so the second ventilatory threshold, which corresponds to a lactate threshold in that lactate reading when you're getting close to 4 millimoles of lactate. And so that's pretty high on the spectrum of intensity. And it acts, for some people, it gets really close to VO2 max, maybe because they didn't push themselves hard enough in the test, or maybe because they can operate at a really high percentage of VO2 max. Okay, so how is that fat burning determined? I don't want to get too technical. Well, I do, but I won't dwell on it too much. But it all has to do with the ratio of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So when you are burning 100% fat, you get a ratio of about 0.7. It's really about 0.69 something. The oxygen consumed compared to carbon dioxide that's exhaled is a ratio of 16 to 23, which ends up at like a 0.69. So that's where that 0.7 comes from. And then when you're burning 100% carbohydrate, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. So it's 6 molecules of oxygen on one side of the equation, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide on the other. And so it's a 1-to-1 ratio. And then how would it get above a 1.0? Well, that's towards the end of the test when you cross threshold, your body is becoming acidic. You have a lot of hydrogen ions and your body needs to buffer that. And one of the ways that you can buffer the acidity in your body is to exhale more carbon dioxide. And so that's that respiratory compensation. And then when we get close to VO2 max, a good measure of a good VO2 max test, one indication is VO2 plateauing, and the other is that RER getting above a 1.1. So you're breathing off a lot of carbon dioxide. So sorry, I was told I wouldn't spend too much time on this, but I gotta pull up some organic chemistry. And so we've got, this is just to illustrate the carbohydrate versus fat burning. And if you look closely at that equation, if you remember that from, I don't know, it might have been freshman biology, but you've got 1 molecule of carbohydrate, you got those 6 molecules of oxygen, and then it yields 6 molecules of carbon dioxide. So that's where you get a 1.0, that RER, respiratory exchange ratio. And then with the fat, that ratio, you see that 16 to 23, that's about a 0.7. And so that's how a lot of the calculations are made. All right, so sorry to get off track. Back to the VO2 max, health span, quality of life. VO2 max tends to decline 10% per decade after age 30, but it doesn't have to. There's no reason why you couldn't have a higher VO2 max really at any given decade. You're fighting a lot of the aging process, but I'll tell you right now, my VO2 max was higher at 45 than it was at 20. So it's not impossible. And I think that for most people, that means really maximizing VO2 max in the 4th and 5th decade. There's no reason that you couldn't be close to your highest VO2 max in that 4th or even 5th decade, and then starting that decline from there, but fighting like hell to hold on to as much of that VO2 max as possible. So that has a lot of implications in what activities you're able to do. And when we live in an amazing place like this in Vail, Colorado, and you want to get out and you want to ski and you want to hike and you have all of these things you love doing, that's why you moved here, and you want to do that into those retirement years, but you get to those retirement years, and if your VO2 max is below 20, there's very little you can do. If your VO2 max is 16 for a female, 18 for a male, The most you can do, stand up from a chair, walk across a room, maybe get up one flight of stairs. So if your VO2 max is hanging out at 27 and you're 45 years old, well, you better increase that VO2 max if you have any likelihood of continuing some of those activities into your 70s or 80s. So here's another depiction of that. Again, I think that it could follow that graph that we share a lot about Healthspan, where you're trying to maximize your health and vitality as long as you can. And you see some of that decline, but it should stay pretty plateaued through those first, the third, fourth, fifth decade, and then start to decline a little bit. So it should follow that graph pretty closely, if you're familiar with that. But this kind of has a hard line there. So that dotted line, independence versus dependence. And so that's being able to get out and do the things, well, not just the things that you love to do, but even take care of yourself and activities of daily living. If that VO2 max drops below 20, you're going to have a really hard time doing that. Then the second graph on the right, this is a more condensed view, but you have VO2 max on the left. And these are some of the activities that you're able to do with different VO2 max scores. I remember in my undergrad hearing that to climb Mount Everest without oxygen, you would need a VO2 max of about 60. So that would be at the highest end of the spectrum. So that would be elite athlete status to be able to just make it to the summit of Everest. And most people don't make it to the summit of Everest without oxygen. So obviously that would be reserved for the very elite. So you see at the top of that graph, somebody running 10 miles per hour, that's a 6-minute mile. You would need a VO2 max in the upper 50s to be able to sustain that intensity for very long. And then it goes down from there. And so you can look at some of these different activities, running 6 miles per hour, running a 10-minute mile. To be able to sustain that for very long, you would need a VO2 max getting close to 40 to be able to do that. And then when we're talking about hiking and doing some of the things that we like to do around here, we do need to really enjoy those activities. We want that VO2 max into the 30s, or to do shorter versions of those, maybe it's the upper 20s, getting close to that 30 VO2 max, just to be able to enjoy some of those activities. And then when we get much below that, we're talking about just taking care of yourself, activities of daily living. Forget about pickleball, forget about tennis. It's just being able to function. So that's why it's so important. So to reiterate, we're talking about maintaining your independence, obviously the most important thing, but then also doing those activities that you moved here to be able to do. And the higher that VO2 max, the higher the enjoyment of a lot of those activities are going to be. And then at the molecular level, the cellular level, it's affecting all systems of your body. So if we get healthier, if we exercise, if we strength train, we endurance train, all of those markers are going to help your health, your vitality, and also be reflected in that VO2 max. We talked about how it declines about 10% per decade, but it doesn't have to. But if you think about that, okay, 10% per decade, if you have a VO2 max of 40 or 50, and you lose, 10% would be 5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute that first decade, and then you're at 4, and then you're at 3. So that's something, you go from a VO2 max of 45 to a VO2 max of 35, you're still doing a ton of the things that you love to do. But if you go from a VO2 max of 25 to 15, now you're not even able to take care of yourself. So VO2 max and performance. Why it's so important for performance is it really sets the upper limit of what you're capable of doing. But it's not the sole determinant. What's really interesting with elite athletes, VO2 max is not the best predictor of performance, because elite athletes, they all have a fairly high VO2 max. They're all above that 97th percentile. All, at least all elite endurance athletes are. And so the differences are made up in other ways. A lot of times it's movement economy, and then it's also something called fractional utilization of VO2 max. So somebody operating at 90% of VO2 max is quite often going to beat somebody that's operating at 85% of their VO2 max. And one example of that, you could do that graded exercise test on the treadmill, and say they both get to the same VO2 max number, but they're doing the same protocol on the treadmill, and one of the individuals goes another minute, another 90 seconds in that test. Well, guess who you think is going to win in that race? Probably the person that went further in that VO2 max test. So either they're using a higher percentage of their VO2 max, or they have a lot better movement economy. So then it's different things that become important. For a cyclist, it's how many watts you're sustaining at that anaerobic threshold. For a runner, it's usually your pace at threshold. That becomes really important. So those things are even more trainable than VO2 max. All right, so what are some common misconceptions of VO2 max? One is that it's only relevant for elite athletes. I would almost say that it's almost less relevant for the elite athletes, because then it's about all those other 1% items that affect performance. But for general population, we can see VO2 max change a lot. So that's that next myth, that VO2 max is not trainable. So for elite athletes, they're looking at other things to improve performance, usually beyond VO2 max. But for the general population, we can improve VO2 max 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%. So it's hugely trainable. And the more sedentary or more deconditioned you are, well, guess what? The more that you can change and train VO2 max. Another myth, that only high intensity training can improve VO2 max. And it's about not just any one thing, but we're talking about steady state training, we're talking about strength training, we're talking about a structured program that uses some higher intensity intervals and uses some of those ranges in between. It's not just what you, if your high intensity interval training is only 10 seconds to 30 seconds, well, guess what? You're not using the oxidative system. You're either using stored ATP or you're using anaerobic pathways. So you need to be able to sustain some of those intervals for a little bit long, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes for a VO2 max interval. And then for those threshold intervals, more like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes long. And other myth, that VO2 max predicts performance. Again, when you're talking about a homogeneous group of people, VO2 max, that all have similar VO2 maxes, it's usually other things that predict performance a little bit better, or in addition to. And then one other clarification, relative VO2 max versus absolute VO2 max. So your relative VO2 max is when we divide it by your body weight. So when we do that VO2 max test, I don't know if anybody has looked at the screen or looked at some of those values, but you might be consuming, say, 3,000 milliliters of oxygen per minute. And so that would be absolute. Then we divide it by your body weight, and then we get that number you're more familiar with. Say your VO2 max is 42. I'd have to do some math, but if we divide 3,000 by, maybe 75 kilograms or something, you might get, something close to a 40 VO2 max. You might want to fact check that. But that gives you an idea that if you have a lot of excess body fat that you're carrying around, that's going to affect that relative VO2 max. So the low hanging fruit for a lot of people that are way beyond the norm for body fat, or above their ideal body fat percentage, is to lose some body fat, and your relative VO2 max will go up accordingly. But then when you get close to essential body fat, that's not the same story, because you may need to hang on to some of that body fat to recover from your exercise from not being in a calorie deficit, or to be in more of an anabolic state and less of a catabolic state. So just trimming body fat is going to work really good for somebody who's carrying around a lot extra, but not for somebody who's pretty close to their ideal body fat. I think we've talked about most of these things, the central factors of VO2 max, the peripheral factors, but again, it's oxygen delivery, oxygen utilization. So how trainable is VO2 max? So yes, genetics plays some role in VO2 max, but let's not focus on things that we can't change. Genetics does not determine the percent by which you can improve VO2 max. And we don't know what those upper limits are. So that genetic influence at 25 to 50%, what does that matter if you're not optimized with your training? That also means that you can improve VO2 max by 15 to 40%, which is a huge amount. That's going from below that 25th percentile to the 97th percentile. I mean, that's a 40% difference in VO2 max. So why set any limits on that? And that's part of having kind of that growth mindset that we're trying to have with all components of Healthspan, is that these things are influenced by your choices and what you do and the work that you put in to your health. And then trained individuals, obviously there's that rule of diminishing returns. As you get close to optimizing VO2 max, it's going to be less trainable. One note on that, though, is that it's going to fluctuate based on your fitness level. So even an elite athlete in the off season, they might be 10% lower than they are in the competitive season. And you say, oh, but I thought an elite athlete can only change it by 1 or 2%. Well, maybe from their peak condition, but it might fluctuate 10% throughout the year. And then it's also influenced by intensity, volume, and frequency. Obviously, how well trained you are is going to have the biggest impact on VO2 max. So how do we train to improve VO2 max? Really, it's basic training principles. A lot of zone 2 cardio is going to make some of those long-term structural changes. You're going to see resting heart rate start to drop because your heart's getting bigger and stronger. You're pumping more blood. You're going to see changes in your blood. You're going to see changes at the cellular level, the mitochondria, the capillary density. So that zone 2 cardio is really good for all those long-term changes. And what it also does, it establishes this base of training so that you get more out of the high intensity. So then you do the high intensity a little bit more sparingly, and that's some of that interval training. And if you just start off with that interval training and that's all you do, you're going to plateau in about 6 weeks and you're going to get really stale in your training. And that's why we need to undulate the training. We need to do a big, very big percentage of that training at some of those low to moderate intensity levels, and then use some of those high intensity levels a little bit more sparingly. And that's where it becomes very individual. And you really just need to adhere to a lot of those basic principles. You need to be able to adapt to the training load. So it has to be progressive, but it has to be individualized to you. And you have to have adequate fuel on board, be able to recover, rest and recover. That's where you're really going to make those changes. But it's all those basic principles. That SAID principle kind of sums it up: specific adaptations to imposed demands. So what you put your body through, your body is going to adapt to that as long as that stimulus is not way more than what you're used to or way less than what you're used to. Okay, I do want to hammer that one point home, that low-hanging fruit that we see for a lot of people. They start to take control of their health. They start to change body composition. You gain a little bit of muscle, you lose a little bit of fat. Sometimes that absolute VO2 max will not change very much, but that relative VO2 max changes a lot. So we talked about how body fat can be like carrying around a weighted vest. So it's going to be weight that's not consuming oxygen during exercise. But if we add a little bit of muscle, You're like, oh, well, that's a lot more weight if I add 5 pounds of muscle. Yes, but it's consuming oxygen. It's helping your body move. And so it's not going to hinder VO2 max. In most cases, 5 pounds of muscle is just going to help your movement economy and it help improve VO2 max. And in almost every study shows that improving or increasing muscle mass is not a hindrance to VO2 max because it's consuming muscle. Unless you were to go crazy with, gaining 50 pounds of upper body muscle, that was only going to be useful for one purpose. Awesome. So then the take home information, we don't train with VO2 max. We don't say, okay, I'm going to go out and ride my bike today at 70% of my VO2 max. We use heart rate. So we use that to determine your heart rate zones. And then we work backwards from the anaerobic threshold. And so we know with those heart rate zones, what intensity zone 2 is, what intensity a zone 4 is. We polarize the training and we use heart rate as the easiest metric to train that VO2 max because heart rate linearly follows VO2 max. All right, take home messages. VO2 max is powerful, trainable, and predictive. It can predict longevity, it can predict performance, and it can predict the quality of life that you're living. Combine strength and endurance training for the best outcomes. Again, strength training is going to shore up your muscles, your tendons, your ligaments, help you move in different planes of motion, prevent injury, and it's not going to hinder VO2 max. So that's a really important component. And then that endurance training is what's going to increase your VO2 max. When you train to increase VO2 max, I like to say that it lifts all boats because when you train VO2 max, if that increases, well, guess what? How many watts, how much speed you can do at anaerobic threshold also increases. What you can do at a zone 2 also increases. So then you go out for a 1 hour or 45-minute zone 2 easy cardio. Well, guess what? You're burning a lot more calories. You're going a lot faster. You're covering more ground. And so it becomes even easier to maintain weight, to lose body fat. So make aerobic fitness a lifelong priority. It has to be trained. And just like anything that can be improved, it can also decline. So if you stop training, you stop pushing yourself, that VO2 max is going to drop, and it drops pretty fast. All right. I think that's all I wanted to cover in my rambling talk, but let's go to some questions if we have them.
Okay, first, realistically, how much can a VO2 max change in 6 months?
Great. Very good question. So again, it is very trainable, and it wouldn't be unheard of to see a 10% improvement in 6 months. Again, somebody who's sedentary is going to be able to improve VO2 max a lot faster. And keep in mind that for somebody who is sedentary, the percent body fat that you use is almost directly going to improve VO2 max by that same percentage, because that is just weight that is not consuming oxygen. So that's the easiest way for most people to get closer to a target range with their body composition, which is also going to result in improved fitness because you're probably using endurance training, strength training to get yourself there. But it can be quite a bit. And even an elite athlete, again, from an off season to peak season, that could be a pretty high percentage also.
Awesome. Our next question is, if I can't run, can I still get an accurate VO2 max from walking or biking?
Yes, absolutely. As long as we're able to take you close to your max. And so if somebody doesn't run or can't run, well, walking on the treadmill with incline, we can probably get you really close to your VO2 max walking. And then same with bike. Bike, we can push you as hard as you're willing to go. And what's really interesting on a lot of the tests that we've done, the thought is that, well, a treadmill is going to have the highest VO2 max values. Well, I've tested myself on both. I've tested a lot of other people, both biking and on the treadmill, and they're very similar. Um, you would want to test on what you're most familiar with, what you do the most. But those values are pretty close no matter how you measure it, as long as you're using a lot of muscles and you're taking yourself to max.
Great. Is VO2 max specific to the activity?
Awesome. Yes, it is, but like I said, they seem to be really similar when we're talking about biking or treadmill, because you can only deliver and extract so much oxygen. Generally, the activities that have the highest amount of muscle mass, so think of cross-country skiing. The cross-country skiers quite often have the highest VO2 max values. But if you took that skier and put them on a bike, they'd probably have a little bit lower VO2 max because they're not able to use quite as much muscle mass. But again, it's not something that most people need to worry about. As long as you're able to push yourself up to VO2 max, we can get a really good value from that.
And is VO2 max impacted by altitude?
Yes, it is. And anybody who does endurance training knows that their capacity is a little bit lower at altitude. So it's going to be a bigger difference for somebody who's coming from sea level to altitude. So some of the people that we've had come from sea level and just do their testing at this altitude, it might be about 10% lower. If they're in that acute phase, only been here for 3 days, 5 days, maybe 10 days. Somebody who's adapted to altitude, we're at 7,000 feet here. It might be more like 5 to 7%, but I wouldn't worry too much about that. When we look at what percentile you fall in, when we're comparing it to other populations, like we care about being able to do the activities you like, and we're trying to get a baseline for yourself. And so we can see what percentile you fit in, but we're not going to correct it for the altitude because we want to be more fit than everybody else in the country. And so let's use the values that you're for the altitude that you're living at right here at 7,000 feet.
Great. And our last question is, what is a good VO2 max?
Good. So maybe a little bit more nuanced here. It does decline with age, and those categories decline with age. Actually, I do have, if we can go back to the slideshow, I do have some percentiles for males and females. We really like a lot of the tests that we do. Let's get a baseline for yourself and let's set some goals to improve it. But we do have some of the standards here, and it does become important to be able to do some of the activities that you want to do. But for really rough comparison, like I said, when we get below that 30 VO2 max for men or women, it can be problematic if you're 30, 40, 50 years old. But if you're 70, 80 years old and a VO2 max of 30, like that is fantastic. And you're still able to do a lot of those activities you like to do with a VO2 max of 30. It's when it drops below 20 that you really have a hard time. But we kind of see if we look at males or females, I mean, elite VO2 max for a female would be above 50, for a male would be above 60. That would be in that top, and this is for a young 20, 30-year-old, that top 97th percentile. And then when we talk about that 97th percentile, for somebody who's in their 70s, we're talking about low 40s or low 30s for females. So it does drop off, but as long as your VO2 max is in those upper 20s into the 30s, you're still able to do a lot of the activities that you like to do.
Great.
Awesome. I think is that it for today?
I believe it is. Thank you so much, Josiah. These are our upcoming classes. We will have Healthspan 101 with Dr. Barry Sandler, Mindset and Resilience with Vicki Kenny, The Bitter Truth About Sugar with nutritionist Christine Pierangeli, and Healthspan and Wellness Retreat in Costa Rica on November 1st through the 8th. You can learn more at vailhealth.org/retreat.